Audio on demand from Vision Christian Media.
The story.
We had to move from one neighbor to another neighbor, and that neighbor had me and my grandmother and few other people in his house for a week. But by that time, my house was already demolished. We had no home. And then it was announced in the country that the killing had stopped. But it wasn't true. It was a lie.
Hi, I'm Jimmy Colefax. Welcome to The Story. Well, at 14 years old, Frida Umuhoza went through one of the most horrific experiences you can imagine. All of her family were killed in the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi people in Rwanda, and Frida herself was left for dead in a ditch. She has written about her experiences in her book called Chosen to Die, Destined to Live, about her miraculous escape from the genocide. Today is part one of Frida giving her first-hand account of what happened. And parents, you might want to have your children involved in an activity in another room as you listen to today's conversation. Frida is sharing her story with Eric Scatterbo in our Melbourne studios.
Frida, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Glad to have you with us. And before we get started in your personal story, let's kind of get a context. What was happening in Rwanda that led to this genocide?
When I was growing up as a little girl, age of 6, and I already studied school, and my parents lived close to the Hutus and the Tutsis, which are the two tribes in Rwanda. And of course, there was a third tribe called the Batwa, which was 1%, and not mentioned that much. But the Hutus was the majority, 84%. The Tutsis were the minority, which is my tribe. And like I said, growing up, I grew up in a village called Nyanza. And I had friends of all kinds. My parents had neighbors of all kinds. My parents were Christians, and I was never told to hate anybody. But of course, when I studied school, that's when I discovered I was a wrong tribe.
Did you know before that?
No, I never knew.
That you were a Tutsi?
I didn't know. My parents didn't tell me. I had never heard of my friends talking about tribes until I studied school. In fact, so what used to happen in school is that principals will come into the classes to count how many Hutus and how many Tutsis are in the class.
Why would they do that?
I would say it was part of the propaganda and was part of the hate brainwashing. You're a child, so you're going to be told what's right or what's wrong. So for a 6-year-old, if you start teaching them racism, it's going to stick. And so when the principal would come into the class, the first week of my schooling, he came in and he asked how many Hutus are in the class. And of course, little Hutu children stood up in the class. Of course, they were the majority in my class. And he then asked for the Tutsis to stand up, and I had no idea what I was. And so a friend of mine, my best friend, whose family was very close to my family, said to me, "Get up, you're a Tutsi," because she was sitting next to me.
Oh, and you didn't know?
I didn't know. So I got up. And the reason to why my friend, even though she was 6 as well, the reason to why she knew was because in 1959, there had been killings of the Tutsis. And so her grandfather was killed during that time. So her parents had told her about the stories of how the Hutus killed the Tutsis in 1959, 1961. And so because she'd lost her grandpa, so she knew the story, but I had no clue. So I stood up, and of course the Hutu children made fun of us, and they were booing us and calling us snakes and cockroaches. I'd never heard of that kind of thing. So I was pretty confused because some of my friends stood up with the Hutus, and so I'm standing up to be a Tutsi, and it happens it's a wrong tribe, and now I'm called a snake and a cockroach, which I didn't understand much of it.
And the principal is encouraging this?
Yeah, the principal didn't do anything because he was Hutu himself, and they knew why they were doing that. So every term, they would come in and they would count, and it was pretty for their own benefits of knowing how many Tutsis now coming into the schools and how many children. Anyways, I went back home that day and I had questions for my mom. My dad, who was a businessman, walked away from home, so he only came home on the weekend. So my mom raised me and my 4 siblings pretty much on her own when my dad would come home on the weekend. So I went back home and I asked my mom, why did you choose to be Tutsis? It's such a wrong tribe to be. And my mom had no answers to give me. And she said, we never chose it. We were born that way. But I hated it. I didn't like being called a snake or a cockroach every time. And I definitely did not like the feeling of being singled out and being hated and being seen as less than a human being by all these little Hutu children. Yeah, so from that time then, we knew we were living in a country where we were not loved, we were hated. So, like I said, 1959 had been the first killings of the Tutsis, and so that led a lot of Tutsis to live in exile in the neighboring countries like Uganda, Burundi, and the Congo. So 1990, these Tutsis that were in exile gathered together wanting to come back home. But the Hutu government, which was, in the leadership all those years, were not allowing them to come. So they formed what they called the FPR, which is like the Patriotic Army, to liberate the country from this oppression. But you can imagine from when I was growing up to until I became a teenager, it went from bad to worse every year. And so 1990, when the RPF, which is the Rwanda Patriotic Front, which is the Tutsi and a lot of Hutus who are not in agreement with what was happening in the country, when they started fighting, then it meant that the killing in the country started in 1990.
So there was a civil war?
It wasn't a civil war. Now, again, it's a genocide being... I'll call it cooking, so to speak, propagandas and hate speeches. And at that point now there's a radio station called LTLM, and the radio station is a Hutu radio station put there purposely to put songs of hate and encourage the Hutus to get ready to kill. And that radio will play their songs of Tutsis being snakes and being the only enemies. Get ready. The help is coming. So
they're just fomenting hate over and over.
Yes. And so 1990, my dad was actually thrown into jail, accused of him and so many Tutsis. He was thrown into jail being accused of supporting this army that is trying to fight and to come in the country.
So they're feeling threatened by this army that's out of the country.
Yes.
The Hutus are.
The Hutus, yes. So in some parts of Rwanda, like Kibuye and other parts of Rwanda, there's already a lot of killing going on, but not where I lived during that time.
And you're just a child.
I'm just a child.
Going through all this.
Yes.
While all this is going on.
Yeah.
And it's getting worse and worse.
Getting worse and worse. In 1993, I then went into a boarding school. So went to a boarding school because that was very common when I went to boarding school. And the first term was okay. The second time when I came back home, before then, my youngest sister was actually killed. And she was killed as a result of being in a hospital and was killed by a Hutu doctor. No reporting, nothing.
Wow.
And a lot of Tutsis are being killed during that time. And we already know, you could, on that radio that I mentioned, you could hear your name. You could be listening to that radio and hear your name on the list of the people that are supposed to die in that town.
Wow.
That's how bad it was. And my dad's name was on it. And so during the second term, which was the Easter term, so we went back home for Easter break. And during that time, that's when the Hutu president was leading the country at that time was assassinated. And his assassination on that same night, it was then put again on that radio, and now this time also on the national radio, that the killing had to start now officially.
So they were blaming the Tutsis for the killing of the Hutu president.
Hutu president.
Even though that has never been proven.
Never. And even then, they had already, this radio, like I said, the radio had been on for a long time. we already knew, even as children, we knew that we were on the list. We were told by our friends at school, 1992, 1993, you were told by your friends, you are on the list. One day we're going to come for you.
Wow.
And so that was just like an excuse, so to speak.
Yeah, so that was a pretense to start the killing.
Yes, and on that night, it was then officially spoken over the radio that all Hutus have to go killing.
You're listening to The Story. Today our guest is Frida Umuhoza, who's giving a first-hand account of what happened during the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi people in Rwanda. We'll hear more of her story and find out how she survived when we return.
The Story. If this program has highlighted something you'd like prayer for, we'd love to pray for you. Call 1-800-PRAY-FOR-ME. That's 1-800-772-936. It's a free call. Or text 0401 132 888.
Hi, I'm Jimmy Colefax and this is The Story. Before we continue, once again, I want to remind you that today we're hearing a first-hand account of what happened during the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi people in Rwanda. And so, parents, today's conversation is not appropriate for younger listeners. Our guest today is Frida Umuhoza, who's the author of the book Chosen to Die, Destined to Live, about her miraculous escape from the genocide. Before the break, Frida shared how the death of the Hutu president in Rwanda was used as a pretense for mass killing of Tutsi people to begin. Now, Frida shares what happened next.
Now we had to leave home. We left our home and started hiding in the forest, in the woods, and we couldn't stay home because homes were being burned, people were being killed. You could hear screamings of people being raped and killed everywhere. So we left our home. For weeks, we had to sleep in the forest, but not too far away from my house, at least during that time. But like the third week of April, that's when we knew that we couldn't even stay close to our house. And when we left, you didn't know that you will ever see your family again. That evening I left. My mom went with the boys. I had 3 brothers and a sister. So I had 4 siblings left at that time and myself. And then my mom asked me and my sister and my cousin who was at my house to go to the neighbor's house, a neighbor who was a Hutu and friend. And then my dad went on his own. So you left and you separated as a family, never knowing whether you will ever see them again. And the reason to why they separated was my mom had a plan. She said, if we all go together, then we die together and nobody survives. But if we split, we have more chances of surviving. So my mom sent me to that neighbor and I spent a night at that neighbor's house. The following day was just it was getting really worse in my area, in my village. And we were then able to survive during at least that following day. And then we had to move from one neighbor to another neighbor. And that neighbor had me and my grandmother and few other people in his house for a week. Now it was now in May. So he had us for a week until it was May. But by that time, my house was already demolished. We had no home. And then it was announced in the country that the killing had stopped. But it wasn't true. It was a lie. So that people now who survived the whole month of April could come
out of hiding.
Yeah, out of their hidings, and they will have them easily. So this man who was hiding us told us about the story of the killing stopped, and we left and went to my grandpa's house. My grandpa was a very godly man, and he was very respected in the community. He used to be a teacher, but also sort of like a community counselor, so to speak. He used to do all the marriage counseling, even though he had no qualifications and everything. But he was a very good man and respected in the area. So they did not want to kill him, but the death they had chosen for him is to just leave him in his house and die over time with no food, no water, nothing, and then kill everybody in the area, and he would definitely end his life, at one point. So when we got home, because we had no home, we decided to go to my grandpa's house, and my grandpa was still alive. He was sitting there reading his Bible, hadn't had any food for days. But I was just very happy to see my grandpa again.
Yeah.
And on that same day, my mom also came home with my brothers, and she also had 2 other boys of her best friend. And then during that week is when then they decided to come and kill us. And the announcement was made in the area, and they had a meeting. They had a meeting on a Friday to talk about our killing over the Saturday, which was supposed to be on the 7th of May. Now, the 7th of May was also the day of the burial of the president who had been assassinated a month earlier. And so they said that the Tutsis that had survived up until then were supposed to be killed on the same day that they buried their president. So remember, they lied to all of us, and a lot of people have returned to their broken homes.
Thinking that it's safe now, you can come out.
And so on the Friday that they had the meeting, one of my brother's friend came to our house and told us that he'd just been on the meeting, and the meeting was supposed to be talking about how they're going to kill us in the morning. Now, my father also had returned home, but he wasn't staying inside the house with us. He was hiding on the roof because, again, my father, being the one man that they were looking for seriously, accusing him being a businessman, he's been giving, so they were accusing him to be giving a lot of money, funding the RPF. And so he said, there's no way I can stay in the open, they're still gonna kill me anyways. So that night, we stayed in the house, and as a 14-year-old, in your head, you're thinking, they definitely, have mercy on us or let us go. But then you know that the killing has been going on for a month. So it's just a lot of confusion and a lot of fear, a lot of terror.
I can't even imagine.
Trauma in your... but we prayed. We prayed all night. My grandfather led us into prayer and gathered all of us. We were 18 people in that home. My mom and my cousins and my aunties. He gathered all of us, and he said to us, tomorrow, it's going to be our last day. The only thing we can do is to repent and die. No one is allowed to run, because we've been running for a whole month, because wherever you're going to go, you're still going to be killed. So the only thing we can do is to stick together and die together. And we stayed in the house. It was raining. We had not had any food for days. And early morning, about 3 a.m., we heard screaming, cries of the children screaming at the neighbors, and they were killing these little children. And the children were crying, saying, "Oh, please forgive me, I will never be a Tutsi again." But we knew the next turn was ours. And we're sitting on the floor in one room, and all of a sudden we see this young man coming in the room. And we're sitting on the floor praying, and he comes in, a guy that we knew very well. You weren't killed by a stranger. You were killed by a neighbor, somebody that you knew very well, who's a Hutu, people that you've grown together, people that you've played with, people that you've, people that were friends.
Yeah.
And so that made it even more painful because there are people that you've loved, you've served, you've lived with. And so when this guy came in the room, he was also the guy that was also, my dad had started and sponsored a soccer team in my area. And so this guy was on the team. So we knew him very well. And when he saw us, and we were just very scared and covered our faces. And I think he just had a little bit of compassion left in him. He had machete and blood on his clothes because he'd been killing. He got out and told the group, "Oh, these people are not here, they've left. Maybe they heard us kill the neighbors and they left." But the one guy that was leading the group would not believe it. So he came in the room, and when he saw all of us, he's just like, "You mean you didn't see all these snakes and cockroaches?" And the young man said, "Well, it was dark. Remember, it's very early. He said, it was dark. I didn't really see them. I didn't see anybody." He said, "Well, if you try to help them, that's wrong. And so for you to be forgiven of your sin of wanting to save them, you're going to have to kill 10 of them."
Oh, wow.
And so he got us, all of us out. He told us to come out. We came out, hiding behind Grandpa because my father is on the roof. They don't know he's there. So the only man that is in the house is my grandfather, who's old. And we're hiding behind him. And my grandfather tried to talk to the whole group and telling them, I've loved you. I've served you in this community. Why are you doing this to us?
He knows all of them.
He knows all of them. We know all of them. These are people that either worked for my family or either were friends, people that we went to church together. And the one guy, the leader, said, don't waste my time because we don't have enough time. Now, the RPF, which is the army that was rebelling the country, wasn't too far away from my town. But
So you would have been liberated.
we could have, but it took them a long time, So then we were led to a ditch right behind my grandpa's house, right where my father was hiding, and he could see everything, but they didn't know he was there still. And going to that ditch, my grandpa, again, a godly man, he led us into a song. And the song said, we are deadly bodies, but our spirits never die. And he told us to sing the song as we're marching towards that ditch. To this day, I remember the very words of my grandfather, and I remember his face turning. And he turned because, you singing, but you're not really sing. The words are not really coming. He turned and said, I said, sing loud, he said that, and die with dignity, he told us. So we marched down to that ditch, and when we got there was even more people, more killers waiting for us. And you were told to lay on your stomach in the ditch, and to make their job easy, there's no time for them to bury, so we all laid in that ditch. Now, we were 16 people left, and we went down in that ditch. And my grandfather tries to talk to them again, asking for forgiveness, but they won't let us go. Before he even finished his sentence, the one guy jumps in the ditch and hits him with a club on the back of his head. And you had a choice. They had given us a choice to either choose from a club, a spear, a machete, or a club with nails, but there was no gun. For you to be shot, you had to pay, because remember, you're a snake, you're less than a human being, so you cost nothing, and a bullet costs money. So if you wanted a better death, you had to pay for it, and we had nothing, and they didn't have guns anyways.
Unbelievable.
And so I had chosen a young man with a club, and so
you literally had to choose how you wanted to die.
Yeah, because I knew with a club, you're laying on your stomach with a club, they will hit you at the back of your head. I thought it was better than a machete, being cut with a machete. And this guy was called John, so he said, fine, I would do it. So when I saw my grandpa being hit, then I had a hoodie and I covered my head with the hoodie. And this, because my brothers were getting up screaming and crying. And so when this guy hit me at the back of my head, and I lost my consciousness. I don't know how long I was unconscious for, but when I woke up, I was bleeding from my nose and my tongue was between my teeth, and and then I woke up. So everybody's dead except people who are breathing their last breath. Like my sister was actually still breathing as well when they buried it. But in my head, I'm like, if I show them that I'm still breathing, they're gonna pull me aside and kill me so bad. As I'm thinking, my dad may come down after they leave and take me out, or I may be able to shake. So a lot of 14-year-old, and I kept quiet, played dead, and they buried and left. So after they left, all my plans of thinking I could shake I couldn't even move because I'm laying in between 15 dead bodies. My sister, who was next to me, takes her last breath, and my auntie does the same. And I'm thinking, I'm just gonna be in here for how long, and this is the worst death I've chosen for myself. But I decided to pray, praying the best prayer I've ever known, but crying at the same time and wondering how it actually ever happened, even if somebody will ever even hear me. But God made it possible and brought the lady that was picking bananas in that area, who was a neighbor to my grandpa, and heard me scream and praying. But she ran thinking, it's a ghost. So she ran fear, and she went and told someone. And the person she was talking to is a guy who actually worked for my grandfather. And he said, sometimes they bury people alive. It must be someone who's still alive. But she says, but it's somebody that voice has been screaming since morning at 3. It can't possibly be someone who's still alive until then, because now it's in the afternoon.
Oh, wow.
And so he says, I'll still go check. So he comes and finds me alive and takes me out of the ditch.
Well, that was heartbreaking to hear what Frida has gone through, literally having to pray like her life depended on it, because it did. Fortunately, her cries for help were heard and someone was able to pull her out of that ditch. It's something so horrible that it's hard to imagine anyone having to go through it, especially someone as young as 14 years old being asked how they would like to die. As believers, we know that in dark times like these, God is our ever-present source of strength and comfort. As the Bible says, "Fear not, for I am with you. Be not dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you. I will help you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand." We don't always understand why terrible things happen to people in this life, but we do know that no matter what happens, the Lord is always with us. As he says, "I will never leave you nor forsake you." Well, we invite you to join us again next time for part 2 of Frida sharing her story, when we'll find out what happens next in her life after the genocide and how she is finally able to forgive the perpetrators. All that and more is coming up next time. Until then, I'm Jimmy Colefax, encouraging you to share your story with someone today.
Next time on The Story.
I kept quiet, played dead, and they buried and left. So after they left, I decided to pray. Praying the best prayer I've ever known, but crying at the same time and wondering even if somebody will ever even hear me. But God made it possible.
Once again, Frida Umuhoza joins us to share more of how she miraculously escaped from the 1994 genocide in Rwanda. Frida is the author of the book Chosen to Die, Destined to Live, about how she was the only survivor in her family and how God has helped her to forgive. That and more is coming up next time.
The Story. Just another way Vision is connecting faith to life.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.